Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here today, and I'm glad that Scott talked a little bit about me being a public affairs professional. And I should say at the outset that public affairs, certainly in my mind, is distinct from public relations. And so I'm not a spin meister, I'm not an apologist for the agency that I represent. And in my mind, I have a fundamental duty to be as transparent as possible about the agency that I represent. And so, to that extent, what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit of the history of DARPA as an agency, which hopefully some of you are familiar with, but I'll go give you kind of a broad background about it. Talk about some of our current programs and also some of the myths that still abound about the agency, because there are some funny ones out there. If any of you spend some time on Twitter or on Facebook and you just do a simple search on, no, you're shaking your head in the back, no, you don't spend time on that stuff, I would discourage it, because some of the things that you see on those channels, are not well founded in either reason or in evidence, and that's what we're all about here, right? And I like also the idea of speaking to the skeptics. And one of the things I should point out before I begin this presentation is that I'm not a scientist. I do not have scientific training. I have a bachelor's of science, but uniquely enough, it's a bachelor's of science in rhetoric. And my master's degree, so yeah, that was always funny to my father, who was a psychology professor. He said, you have a BS in rhetoric and an MA in rhetoric. Like, now you need a JOB, right? Which is a little hard to find with an MA in rhetoric. But that tradition, I think, is very much in line with what the mission of the agency is here for NCAS, and that is to respect both sides to an issue, to look for reason, to look for evidence, and to weigh both of those and ideally arrive at what should be the best solution or the best conclusion. So it's with that background that I meet you today, and I'm very excited about this talk. So really quickly, DARPA was founded, and hopefully everybody recognizes what this is. This is Sputnik. Our Sputnik moment came almost 62 years ago, technically, but DARPA actually just celebrated its 61st birthday on February 7th. So we were stood up by Eisenhower in the wake of Sputnik, because even though I think at the governmental level we well appreciated that satellites were in development by the Russians, and we knew that we were very close in terms of a race to getting something out of orbit. But to the great American populace, there's very little appreciation that the Russians were be so close to us technologically. And Eisenhower, after Sputnik went up, said, I vow never again to have this country be in a position where we are behind technologically one of our peers. And that is the reason for the agency. And the unique thing about DARPA that I kind of love, especially today, it's the government's very bureaucratic, is that the agency was put together with a page-and-a-half memo. The original charter for the agency was very short and very succinct. And so the mission has stayed the same for the 61 years that we've been working, and that is to make pivotal early investments in technology that ideally deliver breakthroughs in national security capabilities. So we take that national security mission very broadly, or we interpret that very broadly. A lot of what we do finds application beyond the military, obviously, to the commercial sector, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those examples here. But this is our reason for being. Some of you probably know that DARPA really had its infancy was very closely tied to that of NASA. Two of the first big programs that we worked on were actually the Centaur and the Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V rocket, we weren't responsible for creating the entire thing, but we worked on clustering the engines together so that it had the appropriate amount of thrust to get out of the atmosphere. And the other portion of it for the Centaur rocket was the liquid oxygen and also the liquid hydrogen mix. That also gave us the ability to reach geostationary orbit, and those technologies are still in use today. This is it's pretty poor. We actually don't have a very good graphic of this. Ivan Amato, who's sitting right here in the midst of us, Ivan can wave. Ivan effectively was the historian for a few years at DARPA. He's shaking his head like, no, that's not me. But Ivan worked at the agency as well, and he knows just as well as I do that even something as pivotal as this, we don't have a great drawing of, which was really unfortunate. So what you're seeing here are the first 4 nodes of what was the ARPANET. And the ARPANET was the precursor to the internet. This is one of the great myths about the agency, is that, and you see this repeated constantly in the popular press, is that we invented the internet. You could make the argument that we had a very heavy hand in, in promoting the early part of the internet, and the first 4 nodes here for SRI, which is right next to Stanford University. I don't know if people here are familiar with the Stanford Research Institute. It actually, yeah.
Uri Geller tests sidekick of
That's true. That's true. So SRI spun off from Stanford and is now its own entity. It's no longer affiliated directly with the university, but that's where one of the first 4 nodes were. Also at Utah, UCSD, Santa Barbara, or SB, excuse me, and then also UCLA. And the other thing that a lot of people don't know is that the original communication method, TCP, was invented at DARPA as well. Vint Cerf, who's now one of the leading evangelists for the internet at Google, is actually a resident here in Arlington, Virginia. He was a former program manager at DARPA, and he and Bob Kahn were the 2 people. Bob Kahn worked as a program manager for us and also at BBN Technologies up in Massachusetts. He and Bob developed TCP/IP.
Were those 4 places picked specifically to have 4 different hosts, so that or was that just coincidental that they were all different?
No, it's I don't know the origin of it. I know that all 4 of the universities were paid performers for the agency at the time, and I think that was really the reason. You'll hear me say the word performer a lot in my talk. So DARPA doesn't refer to its contractors as contractors, and we don't, we're not like NSF or NIH in that we give funds or grants to people that have no strings attached. We provide contracts to our performers, and they meet milestones, and if they don't meet those milestones, then we take our money back very often. So I'll explain a little bit more of that, but the history of the internet started at DARPA. And one of the other big ones is Have Blue. This was the early instantiation of the first stealth fighter. So we were doing a lot of work in material science and then also in radar, so that there you see the severe angles here on the airplane, which reflect radar. Another myth that we talk about is the development of GPS. A lot of people wrongly assume that we developed the constellation, which is not true. Much of that early work belongs to the Naval Research Laboratory and also the Air Force. But what DARPA had a heavy hand in doing was creating the microelectronics and the processors that went into the miniaturization of GPS that we now all have in our cars and phones, etc. This is Amber. This is a first work of an unmanned aerial vehicle. So this is in the late 80s time frame, but eventually this Amber program gave rise to Predator 2, and you kind of see a little bit of similarity to this vehicle and also the Predator vehicle. But we also worked on Global Hawk, which is now responsible for high altitude ISR. One of the big ones that we don't get too much credit for, I guess, is Siri. Siri, uniquely enough, started off as a program called the Personalized Assistant That Learns, which is a mouthful. I'm kind of glad that didn't stick around, but it's very bureaucratic, like DARPA, Pentagon appropriate, right? That it's PAL. And uniquely enough, the program manager for PAL, David Gunning, is now back at the agency. Most of the program managers that we have at the agency serve for only 3 to 5 years on average, and then they go back to either their positions in academia or industry, and sometimes they do come back, we say, for a tour, but it's not an official military tour. We don't operate like that, even though we are in close contact with the Pentagon.
I don't know if you're going to get to this or not. Could you kind of briefly go over the structure of DARPA and whether it has like labs or whether it's just a PMO office, or
I'd be happy to. Yeah, right now actually. So DARPA is a funding agency, and we're located at 675 North Randolph in Arlington, Virginia. We've been there for about the last 5 years or so, and previous to that we were just down Wilson Boulevard and also sort of in the Ballston, Roslyn area of Arlington. And so what you find at that facility is no lab space. It's purely offices, and we have roughly 1,200 to 1,300 employees there, of which there are probably only 200 that are government employees. And out of those 200 government employees, there's maybe 105 that are program managers. So what's unique about DARPA and how it's, I guess, different from the National Science Foundation and NSF is that all of the ideas for the programs come from those program managers. So the ideation, if you will, comes from the program managers, and then it's up to them to marshal resources all over the country, all over the world in some cases, to meet the technical demands that they set forth in their program. And we announce those programs publicly through what we refer to as the BAA process. It's the broad agency announcement process. So we don't put out RFPs technically, but these broad agency announcements spell out in a great bit of detail, and this is all on the Federal Business Opportunities website, they spell out in great detail what we're looking for as an agency. And the kind of unique thing, I think if you're a researcher, especially if you're an academic, is that instead of applying for a grant, you go to a DARPA for a couple of years and you're given a large sum of money. On average, our programs are probably about $40 to $50 million, which is quite large, especially if you're working in academia. And you get the opportunity to go out and cherry pick the very best researchers in the field to be able to try to solve your problem. So that's very unique, I think, within the broader science ecosystem that we have here in the United States. Gunning is a great example. Gunning is not a PhD, he's not an academic, but he's somebody who had been working sort of at the intersection of technology and government for a long time. He was at PARC, he was at SRI for a number of years. And when he first came to us in the early 2000s for the Personalized Assistant That Learns program, he saw quickly the utility of how that program would have application not just on the battle space for battle planners, but also could be used in our own personal lives. And his colleagues at SRI actually spun off, and they no longer were associated with SRI. They started their own company called Siri. And as Gunning tells the story, the Siri developers were sitting around one night and they got a call from Steve Jobs. And Jobs invited them over to his house, said, "I'd like to have dinner with you." And over dinner, according to Gunning, they talked about how they wanted Siri to be in the next release of the phone as opposed to an app in the App Store. And that's why we have Siri today. So one of the other things that we're particularly proud of, and this is a more recent transition, is the Luke arm. Everybody in here familiar with Dean Kamen, the inventor of the Segway scooter? Dean has done a lot besides the Segway. He's a brilliant mind. Lives up in New Hampshire, and we had a program manager named Dr. Jeffrey Ling. Dr. Ling was a neurosurgeon who worked in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and he, even as a neurosurgeon, recognized that it wasn't so much head trauma that he was dealing with on a regular basis, but the signature injury from both the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts was limb loss, because we now have the ability through Kevlar, through our helmets, our vests, really to protect the core of the body, but yet the arms and legs are still exposed. And so he said it's tragic, Dr. Ling, this is Dr. Ling talking, it was tragic, that these people go sacrifice and come back and are given something that is just relatively rudimentary, the pincer grasp. And that technology had not changed for 50 plus years. And so he said, if I was to work with somebody like a Cayman, maybe we could come up with something that has, dexterous movement. Instead of just a couple of degrees of freedom, they're looking for 27 degrees of freedom. And over the course of about a 7-year program, this is called the Revolutionizing Prosthetics Program, they developed a dexterous robotic arm that has the ability to articulate its wrist, move all of its fingers independently, and then also pick up, fine things like a grape, not squish it. So it's now available through the FDA. I didn't know this before I started working for the agency, but you can actually get a prescription for a prosthetic. So if you've lost a lower limb, you can go to your doctor and get a prescription now for this device. Here you see one of the first grand challenges that we ever hosted. DARPA as an agency is pretty well appreciated in the popular space for having hosted these grand challenges. And 2004 was the first one that we ever did. To have a car drive 141 miles through the desert autonomously. So no, it's not being remote sticked, by somebody. It would have to be able through, LiDAR to be able to make sense of its own environment and drive by itself. Funny enough, I was working for SAIC here in town at the time, and I was at this event and got to see this car go across the finish line. This is the Stanford team, and most of the Stanford team that competed back in 2004 and the subsequent challenge in 2005 are actually the people who are leading Uber, Ford, Apple, Google, and all of their, those companies' private car efforts. The first challenge was actually a little bit of a failure. In most of the cars, I think this car went only about 7 miles before it fell off and was unable to find its direction anymore. Tony Tether, who was the director of the agency at the time, he was really hoping that this event would be a big spectacle, because for those of you who know about the agency, Tether was responsible for the Total Information Awareness Office, and that was a time in the agency when it came very close, I think, the entire agency to being closed down, because I think the aims of that program went a little bit too far. And he was really hoping this event would kind of bring DARPA back into, at least the congressional good graces and also the good graces of the American people. And it did serve to capture, I think, a lot of people's imagination. But the nice thing, I think, is that after only 7 miles and what I think a lot of people perceive to be a big failure, DARPA said, no, we're going to do it again. And so in 2005, they held essentially the same event, which was in Primm, Nevada, on the California border. And then several of the cars actually finished. And then in 2007, we had what was referred to as the Urban Challenge. And in that race, it wasn't really a race, but all of the cars finished. So it was 2004, no one finished. 2005, 7 cars finished. 2007, there's several. Ivan, do you remember how many? You wrote it. Yeah, not off the top of my head. One of the other big challenges that we had was the DARPA Robotics Challenge in 2015. And the impetus for the challenge was really kind of unique. It was actually a humanitarian mission. What a lot of people don't appreciate about the DoD is that human assistance in disaster response, or what we refer to as HADER missions, is one of the top 10 strategic objectives for the department. And Gil Pratt, who is now actually the head of research for robotics at Toyota in California, he was working on this program, and it was really because of what he saw after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. Gil was a longtime roboticist from MIT, and the Japanese government had asked him to come over and try to help with the Fukushima disaster. And what was really sad about the Fukushima case was that as the reactor was overheating, they tried to have robotics go in and make simple turns of a valve so that it could release pressure within the system. And they found that because of all of the lead and all of the concrete, that the environment was just simply not capable of carrying communications. You couldn't transmit to anything in there. And so whatever you sent in had to be tethered, but yet there was a lot of debris all over the floor. And so it was kind of an impossible task. And he said, well, this is ridiculous because we have certainly, I think, or he thought, the technical means to be able to develop a robot that would be able to traverse a human environment, just like you and I would. So if there was something that had fallen over or there was a door in the way, a robot should be able to get through that untethered with enough power to make a difference, to do something simple enough as to push a button or to turn a large wheel. And so that succeeded. We had 7 teams that competed in that in the very finals out in Los Angeles, and all 7 teams were able to get through the entire sort of minefield, if you will, of fallen debris and doors, and turning different things, pushing different buttons. So it was a great success. But if you take a look at our YouTube channel, we have a couple of outtakes from that event, and you might have seen this in other sort of popular literature of robots falling down. There's great video of robots falling over and over. And anytime I ever hear from people that we're making Terminators, I always point them back to that, because we are a long, long ways from Terminators as an agency, as a people. Robotics is still in its infancy. One of the more interesting things that we've been doing lately is our work on autonomy. This is actually a fully autonomous boat. It's 132 feet long, and it was just in the press last week. We've actually officially transferred this now from DARPA over to the Office of Naval Research, and it had its own journey from Los Angeles to Hawaii and back by itself. The original researcher, Scott Littlefield, said that it operates under sparse, or what he referred to as sparse supervisory control, which is kind of how I've been raising my children. That it would essentially take GPS waypoints or coordinates and then go and come back. But so it is not fully autonomous, but it does follow the rules of the road on the open sea, so that if it does approach another vehicle, vehicle approaches it, it will maintain distance away from it. And those are called coal rigs. I don't know if we have any sailors in here, but it does follow coal rigs to a T.
What's the ship's mission, or is it at this point just for navigational research?
It was for navigational research, and we were working on it. And unfortunately, the Office of Naval Research has decided to no longer say what its mission is. They've actually classified it now, and will not talk about it publicly. We designed it to be an ISR, truck essentially. You could carry anything on it, and we designed it really for ISR. But Robert Work, who was the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, when we christened this, he imagined that it would be, a nice to have in advance of maybe a carrier strike group, so that you place, this is maybe, this is, relatively cheap. It's a few million dollars to build this, and so if you put that in advance of a carrier that's several billion dollars to build, then it could not only just find threats and report back, but potentially even take care of some of those threats. So we'll see how the Navy continues to develop it. But it's a great way to talk about what DARPA does too, is that very often through the challenges that we've done with cars, through robotics, it's not that we're developing these things for fielding. We're very often just trying to prove a proof of concept. And once that proof of concept has been shown, then we hand it off to either somebody in academia, industry, or government to take to fruition. So here, in all candor, is our budget. And one of the things I wanted to bring along as a little show and tell is the PBR, the President's Budget Recommendation. So when people say, the DARPA is this dark, secret, spooky black agency, say, no, actually it's pretty open. Everything that we do is right here in the PBR. So you can go to our website, darpa.mil, and download the PBR if you want, or you can look through CBO and find the same thing. And you can see even our classified lines of research are all in here, which is pretty open, right? I don't know if anybody in here has read, there have been two very good books about the agency in the last few years. One was called The Pentagon's Brain, and that was written by Annie Jacobson. That kind of falls off in terms of its reliance on facts and evidence, particularly in the last section of the book. It's not terribly accurate, but a better book is The Imagineers of War, written by Sharon Weinberger. Sharon is a local journalist here. She writes now for Foreign Policy, but had been at Wired. She was at Wired's Danger Room for a number of years. Yeah, Sharon's particularly bright, has followed this space very closely, and her book is, I think, a very good historical account of what the agency has traditionally invested in, following its foibles, following its successes, and I would encourage you to read that book. But one of the things she does say is, she refers to us as the Imagineers of War, that it's this, that the agency, and Jacobson more makes this assertion than she, that, we're dark, we're top secret, we are, what do people refer to us as in the press all the time? The Department of Mad Scientists, which is actually the title of another book. And we're always quick to point out that we're mostly a department of engineers, and nor are we particularly mad, we're just interested in fundamental science. And this is how we spend our money. DARPA, relatively speaking, is a small agency. It's $3.4 billion this year that we have in FY19. We'll see what our FY20 dollars are like here probably within the next month or so. That information's not out yet. But you can tell our funding has been relatively flat as an agency for pretty much the last decade. And compared to other heavy hitters in the science funding or S&T community, NSF, NIH, NASA, you can see that we're relatively small. So this is our portfolio. What we're really looking at right now as an agency, Dr. Stephen Walker, who is our current director, came up with this strategy himself. And essentially it's 4 prongs. We're looking at how we can better protect the homeland, and that's a broad mission, not to be confused with the mission of DHS, but protecting us against adversaries who would seek to strike us with cyber means, with biological weapons, and hypersonic weapons, which have been a lot in the news lately. The second major thrust that we're looking at is countering those peer adversaries. What can we do to potentially deter them from attacking us in the first place. And the last one is, even though it's focused on stabilization efforts, it's really all about the soldier. We want to think about what technology we could bring to bear, especially for dismounted troops, because there really hasn't been any great breakthroughs, for dismounted troops in the last 20, 30 years. And girding all of this work is our foundational work. So we have one office within the agency, and there's 6 offices within the agency. That fundamental office is referred to as the Defense Sciences Office, and they are looking at truly, fundamental, basic questions of science and mathematics, physics, chemistry, you name it, and all of that is sort of informing more broadly and girding what we do as an entire agency.
Do any of those priorities come from like wish lists from the other agencies, or do you operate completely like we're just way ahead of you guys?
We're totally blue sky. So that's another thing that people often ask us is whether or not we're requirements driven, and we're not. So whereas the Army Research Laboratory or Air Force Research Laboratory and Naval Research Laboratory are typically responding to requirements from the Pentagon, we have the liberty to look more broadly, further out, and dream what may possibly be. So that's a little bit of a background about the agency. Really quickly, does anybody have any other questions about sort of how we manage ourselves? Or
Do you cross paths with NQTEL, the CIA's venture firm, or your emphasis disjoint?
We're not disjointed. We do collaborate with NQTEL and also more closely with IARPA. Probably IARPA's mission is almost entirely classified, but still there's information sharing there. And our deputy director, Dr. Peter Heinem, just came to us about a year and a half ago from NGA, and most of his background was in the IC. So it's not uncommon that we collaborate with those entities.
Thinking of the Chinese landing on the dark side of the moon and the the satellite they built to get the information back, are we competitive on that one?
I think we are, and this is not me saying this, but our director and our deputy director have talked not so much that we are behind the Chinese. I think in a lot of the popular literature that you see is that we are behind in artificial intelligence, we're behind in quantum computing, we're behind in rockets, and I think our leadership is more bullish and prefers to think that we're ahead. We do enjoy a little bit of a marginal advantage right now, but that we can't afford to take time off necessarily. I think one of the areas that a lot of people have been questioning about here, and our adversaries, our peer adversaries, Russia and China in particular, have been making gains, is in the area of hypersonics. I think some people would criticize the United States, saying that we took time off and maybe didn't think about the threat as much as we should have. But there is a lot of focus on that area of research now, not just from DARPA, but also from the Air Force and our other sister services.
What does that include? I'm not familiar.
So hypersonics is flight 5 times the speed of sound. And we're looking at not just hypersonics, munitions for offensive purposes, but also defense against hypersonics, because anything moving that fast is incredibly hard to knock down.
You mentioned our lead over Russia and China. Unfortunately, they keep narrowing it by essentially stealing our innovations. Maybe you'll touch on some aspect of guarding our, if DARPA is open, is that wise?
I think it is wise. I mean, there is certainly parts of our portfolio, our research portfolio, that are classified, but I think that the kind of science that we're working on benefits from openness because it allows us to have access to researchers from not just the United States, but from all over the world. And I think it's not necessarily that knowing about something is bad, or having our adversaries know about something is bad. I think it's more of a speed to market kind of question. Who can get there faster and who can sustain those capabilities longer? Because I think we've all been operating under the assumption for the last few years that there's this great democratization of technology, right? Whether it's hypersonics or gene editing or cybersecurity, these things now have no true home, and everybody with means has the capability to exploit them. So it's just a matter of being able to, 1, have capable deterrence, and 2, make sure that you that you continue to spend and maintain that capability. Yeah.
I'm a social scientist by training, and I'm curious about, DARPA is often held out as being sort of a model of an innovative place.
Yes.
And in the S&T world, it's not always that easy to get people to be innovative. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about what it is about 10 years ago I interviewed the director of DARPA, and he talked a little bit about some of the structures that were in place that allowed for people not to get sort of stuck in their ways of thinking.
Uh-huh.
And I think you said 105 program managers, and they don't stay very long.
They don't.
So is that part of it? I mean,
That's very much part of it. And we've recently, our leadership has recently been traveling a lot overseas, and we know that countries like Japan, France, Germany, Ukraine have been looking to make their own DARPA-like organizations, and they always want to know what's the secret. Why does it work there, and why have other DARPA-like entities not met with the same level of success? It's hard to replicate in another country because, one, quite honestly, DARPA is only successful because the broader S&T community here in the United States is so robust. Other countries don't have the FFRDCs, the UDARCs, or the UARCs, the good academic institutions that we have. I mean, that's a little biased, I guess, to say that ours are best in the world, but so like federally funded research and development centers, and yeah, yeah. So
there was another one that was what was it?
The UARCs, the University Applied Research Centers. Yeah. So, sir.
I'm just wondering, how did DARPA get a reputation for mind control?
Probably because we've done a lot of research in neuroscience. And I think that if you look at, if you're to have a base level understanding of what that science involves, then yeah, you would probably think that we're messing around with people's brains. I'll talk about that here in just a little bit, but ma'am, I want to come back to your question really quickly. There's a lot of reasons why DARPA, I think, is successful as it is. And part of it is that there's short tenure. So nobody stays there for more than 3 to 5 years, myself included. As a public servant, I'm actually a term employee. I'm now on my 3rd term, which should be my last term of only 2 years, and then I'm to go and find another job. Some people do come back to the agency for multiple tours, but by and large, we take people for just 3 to 5 years. Very often they are, they're IPAs, they're intergovernmental personnel. That's the Intergovernmental Personnel Act. So they come through that act from an academic institution or another UARC or FFRDC just on loan to us. And then they go back to those institutions. And so I think that there's this constant refresh of ideas, for one. And 2, there's really no bureaucracy in the place. There are 6 offices within the agency, and if you want to advance an idea for a program, typically the program manager will make a pitch to his or her office director and deputy director, and they'll vet the idea to go up to what we refer to as tech counsel. And tech counsel is our director, deputy director, and all those 6 office directors and deputy directors. So they sit in front of what is like this either mad firing squad, or you think of it as like a thesis committee from hell, and these guys pitch their ideas, and ultimately it's not a democracy either. Ultimately it's the director's decision whether or not he's going to greenlight a program, and that process can be as a program manager, if you have a wonderful idea and you've already done a lot of the background research, you've done your homework, you've done, you look through all the literature, you understand what's happening in the space already, and you advance the idea, you can probably have something approved in a matter of months. Sometimes it takes researchers a little bit longer, and they'll fund what we refer to as seedling programs, or small studies of maybe less than $1 million, and so they'll go out, they'll tap industry, and they'll try to get an understanding of what's currently being done in the space, and then hopefully move on from there. But if we do a seedling, it's not necessarily to say that we will absolutely dedicate resources for a full-blown program. It's just that, it's a study. Yeah, exactly. So those things I think greatly contribute to the fact that it's nimble, it's very fast-paced. One of our program managers, Dr. Matt Hepburn, came in a few years ago, and he said that when he first came to DARPA, he felt as though if he didn't invent the internet, he would get a B. Like he's failing essentially if he doesn't do something like invent the internet. And Dr. Hepburn is doing God's work. I mean, he's really, really impressive. I think out of all the things that the agency does, his work today is by far the most important. And there's a little bit of success actually that we had last week. This is not at all in my presentation. I'll brag about it really quickly. Dr. Hepburn is funding research on RNA vaccines. And there's a company called Moderna, which he's funding, that's looking at essentially having our own body create the antibodies to fight off major viral epidemics. You know, whether it's influenza or chikungunya, Ebola, those types of things. I think easily within our lifetime, I mean, even maybe within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see vaccines that are not only effective, but we'll probably have a vaccine for flu that, you know, doesn't take us 6 to 8 months to produce. And is only 25% effective. It'll maybe take us 1 or 2 months to produce, and is almost 100% effective. So that type of work is really amazing, and I think, I don't know, we don't talk about that a lot right now because the results we just went to phase 1 clinical trial. There's a small population of patients that are involved in it, but you know, we're pretty hopeful. So what I want to do is talk a little bit too about, despite our history, our great history, and these books that have been written about us, talk a little bit about the myths that still abound about the agency. And these are some of my favorite because I do operate in public affairs. I get exposure to all of this stuff, and it's a blast because sometimes the ideas are incredibly outlandish. And the funny thing is like they're very often, sort of they have a basis, or like there's some element of truth to every one of them, right? But yet writers today will embellish. And I don't know if we have any reporters here, any authors. Good, I'm not offending anybody in particular, but the environment that we operate in now as scientists and as science communicators is certainly different than it was maybe 5 to 10 years ago. You probably all appreciate that many of the reporters who are working for major publications today are probably freelancers, and so their responsibility is to themselves, to feed themselves, right, and their families. And in order to do that, they have to publish as much as possible. So they have to get content out, really, really quickly. And unfortunately, the standards for good content have kind of dropped off. And so sometimes what we see, what's that? Thanks to the internet, yes. We're partly responsible for that. Again, I'm not an apologist here, so I'll take that criticism. But yeah, so we see sometimes that reporters are way too quick with what they hear from the agency. There'll be a little kernel of truth, but then they'll pump it up. Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, just to get the clicks, and then to move on to their next story. And the first one is a great example. I don't know if there's anybody here who works for history. I know that Discovery used to be here in Maryland, but history is they're a real piece of work. We had been working on a self-steering bullet, and this is honest-to-God technology that does work, and it can be fielded. It's wildly expensive. We can't bring the cost down fast enough probably for it to actually find application in the field, but it is a bullet that fired out of a long rifle will actually steer towards its target. And it can't even hit a moving target. We have video of this on YouTube, and it's amazing. I mean, it's really, really cool. It'll take your average shooter who has no experience whatsoever with a long rifle and turn them into a marksman. And that's awesome, right? But why we would use it to kill aliens? I don't know. I don't know why you would do that. 2, we were at a conference actually up in New York City probably 3 years ago, and one of our program managers there was saying that the work that we were doing in synthetic biology could someday, thousands of years from now, give us the ability to maybe terraform a planet. And so this reporter, I think it was from Ars Technica or another technology source, or no, it was Motherboard, ran with that and said that DARPA is working on a super secret program to terraform Mars. And you would think, given the content of the article, that it was something that we were working on that day, that we were duty bound to terraform Mars. That's not the case. We're not doing that, and I don't think NASA is even doing that. Here are another couple of doozies that I like, and we can talk about brain-mind control here for a second. DARPA is implanting chips in the brains of wounded U.S. soldiers returning from the Middle East. This is patently false. We don't do that. The only people who are actually being implanted right now as part of our neurological programs are people who currently they're suffering from Parkinson's disease, and so we're looking for people who already have are necessarily having surgery to open up their skulls. You know, we don't want to open up people's skulls just willy-nilly and for no good reason. So typically there's another compelling reason to do so. And the early brain research is really kind of inspiring. All of it is being done by academics at schools like USC and Dartmouth, and those are the two best schools I think that are making progress in this regard. And they are showing that you can conceivably, you know, write and read memory, and these are basic memories, not, you know, full-blown memories about, you know, I don't know, how to fly an F-35 or how to launch nuclear weapons or things like that. They're declarative memories, like, you know, where did you sleep last night? Did you go to the bathroom recently? Where are your keys? So these are very simple things. And for those men and women who have traumatic brain injuries coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, this is a real breakthrough. And that's where the research is coming from. But we're not actually working on any soldiers' minds.
Just to clarify, so these are Parkinson's patients that are already cleared for deep brain stimulation.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. And these are very small patient sample sizes of maybe 5, 6 patients. Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, USC and Dartmouth is doing that work. The Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland is doing a lot of this work for us, as is the University of Utah. DARPA is rumored to be genetically modifying humans to create zombie super soldiers. We get zombie super soldiers all the time, whether they're genetically enhanced or robotically enhanced. It's spurring comments like this. This is from Sputnik, so it's not exactly one of the best sources in the world. It's what we refer to as an adversarial source. And so Sputnik, around the time of the DARPA Robotics Challenge, put this out and said that, you know, if you would read the article, you think we all be murdered in our beds, you know, by these enhanced robots, which is ridiculous because the robots will just tip over. One of my all-time favorites is a program known as HARP. And HARP, of course, is responsible for controlling the world's weather, earthquakes, floods, tornadoes. And there are a fair number of people who think that HARP, which is studying the ionosphere from an array in Alaska, just outside of Anchorage, that, you know, we are really controlling the world's weather with this. HARP is actually run by a university consortium that includes about 10 different schools, and DARPA, even though we funded a portion of it, is not the principal funder of it. ONR and also AFRL, the two service research labs, are actually the ones that really run it. Battlefield Medicine was a program that we had, and there's some people who've mixed up a couple of different programs. This is not a DARPA image, this is not a DARPA-funded robot, but this image is attributed to the agency on a regular basis. I don't know if any of you here are fans of Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is kind of a comedian. He runs a radio show or a podcast, and he was really, I guess he got a lot of news recently because he was interviewing Elon Musk, and that's the interview in which Musk was smoking pot with the person opposite of him. And so Rogan is a bit of a conspiracy theorist, and he looked at a program of ours that probably about 15 years ago looked at using biofuels to refuel unmanned vehicles, robots. And so this program, which was led by researchers at MIT, was using biostuffs, grass, bark, etc., so that it could refuel itself on the battlefield and then go around and, you know, pick up mines, do whatever. But he said because it's capable of eating biomaterial, that it was picking up dead soldiers and eating them. Yeah. I'd never once in my life, as a public affairs specialist, ever had to refer directly to to the Geneva Convention. I've never once had to look at it. But believe it or not, it's against the Geneva Convention to do anything with dead on the battlefield, and that's not something that your United States is going to do. That we invented Facebook to control people's information is a real is a real doozy. And so if you look at Twitter right now, or if you look at a site like InfoWars, led by Alex Jones, you see these types of conspiracies. Yeah, Alex Jones hates DARPA and spends a lot of time about talking about the agency. But here's a legitimate article from Wired, and it was dated back in the 4th of February, 2004. And it's talking about a program that DARPA had at the time called LifeLog. And LifeLog on its face sounds very similar actually to what Facebook does, because this, mind you, was in the post 9/11 phase where we were looking for ways to make sense out of vast, bits of data. So we're trying to collect information about, spending habits of people, where they spent their time, etc., and ideally being able to piece all of those things together so that we wouldn't miss another terrorist in our midst, right? And LifeLog, rightfully, I think, was shut down. It just spooked too many people, and it was seen as a real threat to privacy. We don't conduct that kind of research anymore. I think it. What's that?
You don't need to.
We don't need to. No, that's the thing. Like your information is not at threat from us. That's for sure. But because we shut that program down, and then it was reported on the same day. That's the only coincidence here. It's just that it's a coincidence. That's the same day that Facebook started, and so people think that we're running Facebook. That Zuckerberg is actually a robot that DARPA made. That's my favorite one. This is a doozy. This is from the. This is a real picture. It's photoshopped, obviously, but a picture from a real publication. I won't name the publication to keep them safe, but we have a program called the Persistent Aquatic Living Sensors, PALS, another PALS program, but this one's not the personalized assistant. So the Persistent Aquatic Living Sensors is as it sounds, and this is really kind of fascinating if you ever talk to a marine biologist. When you move something through water, whether it's a small UAV or is even something as large as a submarine, it will create voids in sort of the biosphere, or the environment in the ocean. And so you can see where submarines have traveled just based on these voids. And one of our researchers was like, well, this is genius. Effectively, what's happened here is the fish have become sensors. And if we can find these shoals that have been perturbed or displaced, then that tells us where the submarines have been going. But lo and behold, if you were to look at some of the writing that took place after this program was announced, you would think that we're weaponizing all marine life. And this was a reputable source that published this. So why do people think that? Well, this would be my transition to end here. Probably because the agency used to be a pretty black place. Back even as just 15 years ago, during the Dr. Tether days, most of what the agency did was marked FOUO, or it was classified. So we didn't put out press releases. We didn't have much of a presence on the internet. What we did have was black and very shortly written. And by contrast, today, it's much more bright and light and open. So we put out press releases about pretty much all of our programs, save those that are classified. And we have a very active social media presence on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and where at all possible, we are very transparent about the research that we're conducting and the research that's being conducted for us by our partners in academia and industry.
Nice cover for what you're really doing.
Exactly, yeah. So no, if you want to know what we're really doing, again, just look at the PBR. This is everything is out in the open. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So I talked a little bit about hypersonics. Here's an artist rendering of a hypersonic strike vehicle. This is an acknowledged program. We know that it exists, but the details about this program are classified. I'm not at liberty to discuss them in any detail. One, I don't know, because even though I hold a security clearance, I'm not read into the most highly classified material that we have. So I know that we do this, and you can find out information about this. In fact, in the PDR, we have something that are referred to as RIDs. Those are the Research and Development Description Summaries. Great, huh? You guys are learning all kinds of acronyms today. So in the RIDs, you'll see detailed information about the status of every single one of our programs. So there's no need to ask. No need to think that we're, not telling the truth here. One of the big areas of research that we have right now is in autonomy. What you're looking at is a completely autonomous helicopter. It's not being flown by anybody. And the idea for our autonomy work is not to take or supplant the human in any one operational scenario, but actually to assist them. So if you talk to a helicopter pilot or even a plane pilot, I don't know if we have any pilots in here, you know it's a full body affair. You have to use both of your arms, you have to use both of your feet to control the rudders and flaps, and anything that you can do to give those pilots the ability to free up their mind to conduct, well, in the military, conduct strike missions or EW, electronic warfare missions, the better, right? And especially if you're flying in hostile areas or flying in environments that are difficult, like mountainous or bad weather, you name it, then that really frees them up. So that autonomy work is really interesting. One of the programs right now that we've taken a lot of criticism for is called Insect Allies. Now, Insect Allies is a little bit radical. Even if you were to look beyond what I've said is sort of your surface level interpretation of it, we are in a lab, in a laboratory controlled setting. We are looking at the possibility of spreading good viruses through a vector. In this case, the vector is the insect, to our crops to relay good virus, so that in the event of drought, blight, adversarial, perturbations like, maybe there's somebody has introduced a virus to our wheat crop or our corn crop here in the United States. Well, that has not just national security implications, but also global, security implications. So we're looking at ways that we could prevent those types of things from occurring. And when we first announced this program, people were very, very concerned, and rightly so. I mean, we're genetically modifying insects to pass on good viruses to crops. And I think, one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up, and one of the reasons we talk a lot about it as an agency, is that I think it benefits from transparency. There is now a broader discussion in the scientific community about the role that genetically modified insects should have. And whether it's preventing Zika, like in South Florida, or if it's preventing the loss of crops, then that is something that we should have a discussion about in the United States. And what DARPA is doing is not a free release of these insects, but instead, these are all in controlled laboratory experiments. We're just seeing if it's possible. And we want to know, can an adversary spread bad viruses this way to take out our crops? And if so, how do we protect against it? There are just two final things that I'll show you that we're working on. One is related to our revolutionizing prosthetics work that I talked about earlier. And this is a program called Haptics, which is now giving the sense of touch to these prosthetics. So this gentleman here, who's in our clinical trial, this is Johnny. He's a Florida resident, and he actually lost his arm not in service, but I think to an electrical accident where he touched a live wire. And if you would tell somebody with a prosthetic that to reach into a bag and to grab their keys or to grab their sunglasses, you'd be like, well, I'll have to root around in there for a while, right? Because they have no sense of touch. And so now we have been placing very fine sensors on the fingertips and surgically implanting wires back into the peripheral nervous system that communicates to the central nervous system. And the remarkable thing is that these patients, again, very small patient population of like 6 to 7 patients, they're reporting that they're able to feel and touch for the first time since they lost their limb. And not only that, they're also reporting that they no longer have the sensation of phantom limb. Yeah. So I don't know if any of you here remember Miles O'Brien, who was a longtime aviation reporter for CNN. He now works for PBS. He's worked with us on a few different stories, and I had the opportunity to talk to him. And he's a lower limb amputee. He said that he lives in constant pain. He feels as though every day that his limb has sort of been torn from his body. And so to have that go away, I think is a big victory. We have well over 1 million people in the United States living with lower limb loss. The very final one that I was going to show was just to highlight what we're doing now as an agency, or what a major priority is for the agency, and that's space, which kind of brings us full circle here, because we started really as a space agency. What you're seeing here is our XSP engine. This is the experimental space plane. So it's a plane that we're working on with Boeing, roughly the size actually of about a 737. This is Boeing, who's the performer, so of course they use Boeing terms to describe it. But you have an engine like this, and this is a spare from the space shuttle. And what's unique about it is that we fired it this summer 10 times in a row consecutively within 10 days. And it's a big technical feat because it's actually hard to dry off an engine in that amount of time. because you're using liquid oxygen, and it produces a lot of condensation. Actually, the cloud that you see that leaves after a firing of an engine like this is not smoke. It's just all water vapor. Sometimes you even get what's called a rocket cloud. Has anybody ever seen a rocket cloud? Yeah, you've seen a rocket cloud. It was really fascinating. I got to see this fire in Mississippi, and so right after it's gone off, the cloud will coalesce, and then you'll get little rocket rain, and it's really fascinating. But this firing this summer, and so hopefully we'll fly this plane within the next 2 years, and that will give us ready access to space. And this underscores I think a lot of what the work we're doing right now is how do we take advantage of low Earth orbit. We've been, I think, as a country, focused on geostationary orbit for a long time. It's very hard to reach that orbit. It's very expensive. It takes large, very heavy rockets, and the assets that we put up there, like our GPS and SBIRS satellites, they're billion-dollar assets. And we know now that those assets just aren't safe, as our adversaries can take them out whenever they want. So if we have the capability to reach space quickly and reconstitute a fleet of satellites, that are maybe $1 million, $2 million a pop, then there's a lot less incentive for our adversaries to try to take them out. So that's a broad overview of the agency and kind of what we're doing right now. Hopefully it answered some of the questions you may have in your mind about who we are and what we do and what we don't do. But would love to take any questions you have. Thanks.
Does DARPA have any connection with the Air Force X-37B, the sort of mini space shuttle on man?
We did, and it's very similar to what I think this XSP design will look like. Yeah.
What's the initials on that?
XSP. There's an interesting backstory there. We did call it XS1, I believe, initially. Is that right, Ivan? You were there during that. And Chuck Yeager's wife took great she was, yes, umbrage to calling it the XS1 because the Bell one originally had that designation, didn't want anything remotely like it. But we thought because it had the S designator, it was a space vehicle, and that would make it clear enough that it was an X1. So we were trying to be deferential to Mr. Yeager, but we just figured in the end it was best to completely rename it, so it's now XSP.
It seems like a lot of the things you work on are far enough out that they're long-term type things, but your, I guess, I don't know if you call them your program managers, your principal investigators are like there for 2-3 years. How do you manage things that are longer than a 3-year chunk?
It's hard for our program managers because they give birth to these ideas and then very often don't get to really father them, if you want to extend the metaphor. They ideally are working with program managers, or they have identified people who will take over for them after 3 to 5 years that will continue to see it through. But sometimes it happens that the programs don't finish or don't transition. And I know that's tough as a researcher, right? Because I think all of our program managers are very heavily, personally invested in what they do.
And who makes the decisions, like the funding decisions for, okay, this is worth spending 3 to 5, 10 years looking at? And
it's the program manager in concert with their office director and deputy director. So they'll do a lit review, a basic lit review, and then they'll also do sort of an informal survey of the scientific community and have an idea of what which performers could potentially support them on their work. And I think based on those discussions, they'll scope how many resources they need and the facilities that they need. So like a program like XSP, where we're test firing a shuttle engine, is incredibly resource intensive. It's well over $100 million probably, but another maybe social science program that we have is a low level effort, of $20-30 million, or lower level. Yeah.
I can just sort of also comment from my 10-year ago conversation with the director. One of the things that I found so fascinating was that one of the reasons for keeping them short term, apart from just the idea of fail fast, fail well, right, and learn from it, because that's really certainly a big chunk of it, was that what he was saying was, I don't want somebody who's been invested in this for a very long time and maybe failed. When another idea like it comes along, say, nah, don't do that. We tried that before. Because the technologies underpinning any of those things change so much that you really need a fresh person.
They become wedded to them.
Right. And wedded to the idea that what you're trying to do, I already tried to do and I failed.
It's a little frustrating as a public affairs professional to be perfectly candid, because we would like to be able to go back and look in a knowledge management system and see why a program when it started, when it ended, why it failed, and we do keep records, but we don't keep strong records that are so easy to find like that. And I mean, there are definitely discussions about whether or not we've done similar work in the past and why it's worked or why it hasn't worked. But for the most part, our researchers are not biased by that. Sir?
The Pentagon, I think, recently said that climate change is considered like a strategic, it's a strategic threat. Thank you. So, what kind of technologies, or what is DARPA's role in, kind of meeting some of those things? Are there, technologies that they're working on? Are there, I guess, yeah.
There's nothing in the current research portfolio, I think, that would assist, be beneficial to climate change. Maybe 10 years ago or so, before I was with the agency, we focused more on different energy programs and fuel saving, but I think a lot of that work now is principally being done by ARPA-E at the Department of Energy. Yeah?
What's the buzz? What are people thinking and saying about the Space Force thing?
At DARPA, honestly, we haven't talked about it that much. One of our offices that's attending to space, our tactical technology office, takes the long view that whether it's the Air Force or whether it's the Space Force, it doesn't particularly matter. We're looking at what capabilities we'll need 20, 30 years from now, and they would just be the component that's in charge of ultimately transitioning it and using it. So there hasn't been any, to be honest, I have not heard strong opinions about it. Yeah.
You mentioned Imagineers of War, Sharon Weinberger's book. What were your perspectives on the accuracy and so forth of that?
Sharon's book is a particularly good treatment, I think, of the history of the agency, and that history through the 60s and on through the Vietnam War in particular, I think it's one, it's troubling, and two, it's not really well told, and I think in any other form. So she did a really good job, I think, of direct sourcing a lot of material for that book, and tells the story of the early part of the agency that, particularly during the Vietnam War, we're working on a large program called Project Agile, which gave us several different capabilities and technologies, one of which is we did an early study with the M16. It was the AR-15. This weapon now is popular because of mass shootings, unfortunately, but DARPA was not the developer of that gun. We bought about 100 of them, gave them to infantry units in Vietnam to see whether or not they were successful, if they could take the jungle conditions, and they worked so well that they eventually became sort of the firearm of choice for the armed services. But another project within Agile was Agent Orange, and of course that history is obviously negative, and I think she chronicles the reasoning, the context in which those decisions were made and took place very, very well.
And have you ever been sued, and have you ever had to prove that you didn't do something?
We get sued every once in a while. I don't know, to be honest, how often we are sued, but I do talk to our general counsel quite regularly, and he seems to be pretty okay with it. We respond to FOIA requests. I don't believe that, certainly in my history with the agency, that we've been sued for information, but the one case that we did attend to, I think during my tenure, that was fairly high profile, was OATK, which is now OATK is now part of Northrop Grumman, and they were bidding on the Robotics Servicing and Geostationary Satellites program for us, and were essentially an aggrieved bidder. They said that the program didn't comply with space policy, but space policy, which is from the executive branch, is actually not law. So they brought suit against us based on that policy, and the case was thrown out in court. So that's the one bit of litigation that I can recall working on, but I'm sure that there are others, probably other aggrieved bidders that bring suit against the agency. I just don't have much insight into it.
Does DARPA apply for patents, either to license technologies or as a defense against someone else patenting and restricting?
We don't, and that's one of the other good myths I think I'm lucky to be able to address, is that we don't retain IP, or intellectual property, from any of our performers. I think what's hurting the Department of Defense broadly and DARPA indirectly is that a lot of people, especially those in Silicon Valley, think that if they work with the agency that they'll give up the ability to patent, and then they'll lose that IP. But it's not something that just applies to DARPA. There was a law that was passed in 2012 by Congress saying that any funding agency could not take intellectual property of the performer that they're supporting. So no,
So you pay a performer and they get the patent?
Correct.
But they can't charge the government for that. If the government, right.
Government retains first use rights.
Right.
Yeah. So if we deem that there's a compelling national security reason to be able to use and retain that technology, or not have it, or deem that it's not suitable, for international sale through ITAR restrictions, then yeah, we'll keep it. Sir?
So is there a publicly accessible repository of all the classified projects that DARPA's worked on?
All the unclassified ones? No, I don't think that there is a repository. The best repository that we have probably is the internet. So if you look at DARPA.mil, there is a very thorough accounting of most of the programs within recent history. And then the other thing that we actually use quite a bit, and there's nothing special about it, is the Wayback Machine. If you go on the internet and look up Wayback Machine, you can find our website as far back as I think 2002 or 2001. Right, thank you very much.